welcome to the Welsh Aesthetics Forum. If you are a dentist, you are in the wrong place. And that was a mistake I made with the room booking, but we are all in the right place, so that's great. So the Welsh Aesthetics Forum was founded by Panos Paris and myself a couple of years ago now. And we host aestheticians and philosophers of art to academic and non-academic audiences in Wales. Its current base is here in Cardiff University, but eventually we're hoping to expand across Wales as well. And the forum is made possible through the generous support of the British Society of Aesthetics, and so that means it's free and open to the public. So I'm very happy to welcome our very first speaker of the academic year, Dr. Colette Olive. Colette is from the University of Leeds, where she's a teaching fellow, and Colette is also a part-time lecturer at NYU London. And before this, she taught at Cambridge and earned her PhD at KCL, and her research is mainly in aesthetics, modern European philosophy, and the philosophy of love. There is a handout for the talk. Does everyone have one or is near to one? Because it's a great turnout, and I'm not sure if... Oh dear. Okay, some people might have to share and then move some around as well. Great.
Yeah,
So Colette will be presenting on loving attention and aesthetic experience. Thank you, Colette.
Thank you very much. Thanks everyone for coming. It's a much better position to be in, to be short of handouts than to be in an abundance of handouts, so I'm glad that we're short of you. If anyone would like the handout who doesn't have a paper copy, I'm very happy for you to email me afterwards, and I can send you one as well if you'd like a digital copy. So yeah, thanks for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. Despite having to navigate cross-country and GWR rail this morning, which is like a sort of specifically nightmarish combination of rail providers, I think, actually. So I'm going to be talking, as Daisy said, about loving attention and aesthetic appreciation. I'm specifically interested in what the philosopher Iris Murdoch has to say about these things. And I'm going to start with what I think is probably quite a common sense idea, which is we don't tend to think that people who are steeped in great art, who have phenomenal taste in music, who read lots of great literature, are more likely to make better lovers than anyone else, right? If my dating life is to go anything to go by, that's true, right? Generally, the better the taste in music, the bigger the red flags are, right? So when I've presented this before, I've sometimes referred to this as the soft boy objection, right? Today I'm going to refer to it as the better lovers objection, which is the thought that it's not intuitive to think that having a kind of better capacity for aesthetic appreciation, being a better critic, being able to make kind of adroit aesthetic judgments would necessarily make you a better lover, a better partner, more kind of attentive in your interpersonal relationships. And yet there are some philosophers who think that there is a connection between these things, right? There is a connection between loving attention and aesthetic appreciation. Iris Murdoch is one of them. And Iris Murdoch thinks that actually these two different kinds of evaluation have quite a lot in common. For one thing, we tend to think that aesthetic appreciation is a kind of mode that is directed towards something that is appreciable for its own sake, right? Which is also true of the ones we love. For another, we tend to think that it's important when we're loving people that we're unselfish. And similarly, people often posit that aesthetic appreciation should be disinterested. So there are various features, I'm going to go through them in a little bit more detail today, that suggest there could be quite a lot in common between how we love people, how we experience loving people according to this model of loving attention that Murdoch develops, and how we appreciate artworks, how we value artworks. But there are, within the literature, within the kind of Murdoch scholarship, well, several objections to this kind of view, but I'm going to focus on three for the sake of today. Three objections that I think are particularly pertinent for the Murdochian who's kind of going to develop this account of love that is supposed to be in salient ways similar to evaluating artworks. The first is the thought that disinterested appreciation, which is often kind of considered a hallmark feature of aesthetic appreciation, is kind of a strange model for love. So I mean, for one thing, you know, whatever your views on Kant are, Kant is pretty clear that we should make judgments of beauty apart from self-interest. So we shouldn't let our particular kind of needs or wants or desires filter into our aesthetic evaluations, such that really we might be kind of basing our judgment about something beautiful on whether or not it's kind of satiating us in some way, satisfying some desire we have. He makes it pretty clear that that's not what we should be doing. But of course, we are kind of greatly attached to the people we love. It would be weird if, you know, I said to my partner, I love you, but in a really disinterested way. And that was supposed to be a kind of mark of genuine love, right? That's kind of perhaps a little bizarre or counterintuitive. And I'm not the kind of first person to articulate this, other people have, so today I'm going to kind of attribute that view to a couple of people, including Daniela Dover. And it's basically the thought that disinterestedness does not seem like a good fit for an account of love. But there's also another objection, what I'm going to call the better lovers objection, which is the one I started with, which is we don't tend to think that being better at aesthetic appreciation, making kind of more adroit aesthetic judgments, being able to kind of appreciate nuance and artistic features, being incredibly sensitive to beauty, tracks with being a better lover. And presumably, this kind of evidence, this lack of correlation, would speak against a view that wanted to connect these two things, right? So it's the better lovers objection. The last objection I'm going to speak about is what I'm calling the impersonal objection. And this comes up a lot anecdotally when I tell people I work on Iris Murdoch. There's a philosopher of love at Leeds, whom I shan't name, who once said when I told him I worked on Murdoch that, well, the problem with Murdochian love is it's all a bit cold and sexless, right? And I think that lots of people feel that way, that it's all a bit cold, detached, impersonal. It doesn't allow us to kind of love people for what makes them very distinctive and particular. Because instead we're supposed to take up this kind of disinterested mode of engagement, right? These are the three objections that I want to talk about today. I think they all stem roughly from a common source, which is misunderstanding the analogy that Murdoch wants to make between art and love. It's an analogy she's really drawn to, that she uses throughout her work, comes up in kind of her early and late works. But it's one that I think is often misunderstood, and it's one that I also think has limits. I think there are limits to the analogy that Murdoch is actually quite explicit about. But these limits, and I think the nuances of the analogy, often get lost in the reconstructions of her work. So what I want to do today is to kind of bring out those features and kind of use them to diffuse or disarm some of these objections, right? So I'm going to start just with a little bit on what Murdoch says about love, just in case people aren't kind of as familiar with her work as I am, right? Alongside the kind of metaphor of art, Murdoch often articulates her account of love using the metaphor of vision. So she'll talk about, you know, the patient eye of love. And those of you who are familiar with the sovereignty of the good might know that that kind of opens with this very famous example of M and D, a mother and a daughter-in-law. And that is all about looking at someone attentively, exercising what Murdoch calls a just and loving gaze. And she thinks that our moral work really lies in perfecting our perception of others. Perfecting our perception of reality more broadly, but in the kind of moral case, very specifically others as well. And to do this perception, we need to practice what she calls unselfing. So in order to properly understand you, right, in order to kind of properly attend to you, to understand what's going on with you, your reality, I need to kind of silence as much of myself as possible, right? If I'm trying to understand my partner, and all I kind of really do is I see them as I wish they were, right? I see them as like a project that I'm hoping they'll improve, you know? So I'm like, oh, well, maybe you're not great now, but you've got potential, right? And I think you're going to get better. There's a sense in which my projection onto them is going to really stop me properly engaging with their reality, right? My kind of self-interested projection of how I wish they were secretly, deep down, right? My expectations for who I want them to be, rather than my perception of how they really are. In some instances, in loving relationships, that might be paired with things like disappointment, anger, emotions we feel towards our partners when they let us down in significant ways. All of that, right, all of that messiness, Murdoch thinks gets in the way of properly loving someone. Because it gets in the way of properly understanding someone, properly perceiving someone. And so what we need to do is we need to unself. And this doesn't mean we need to kind of destroy the kind of the self as we know it, right? What it really means is that we need to try and purify or reorientate our desires. So rather than looking at my partner and seeing someone that I wish they were, I should kind of silence the thoughts about who I wish they were, right? I should kind of silence my own sort of desires and projections and instead focus on them. And then I'm in a place to properly understand them, to properly see them as they are, right? And this is what Murdoch talks about when she talks about a just and loving gaze, because it's about kind of perception without kind of selfishness, perception without reverie, as she sometimes puts it, which is a kind of Wehian phrase, perception without fantasy. Right? There's no kind of fantasy of this person as I wish they were, no fantasy of this person as I remember them being, right? Maybe when we first started going out, something like that. You get rid of that fantasy. That's what you need in order to kind of see clearly. And that's what it is to do justice to reality in Murdoch's terms, to kind of be obedient to reality, as she puts it elsewhere. And that's what we need to do in love. For Murdoch, we need to do justice to other people, to focus on them, right? Now, she's not going to say that there's no desire in the picture, right? That there's no desire that's involved in love. Of course there's desire that's involved in love. It's just that desire can't be self-interested, can't refer back to the self in a significant way. And I think that this is what sometimes gives her the reputation for being quite austere, because it kind of makes it sound a little ascetic, I guess. But what she really means by this is that in not kind of desiring other people for the role that they might play in our own plans and projects, we're able to then desire them for what is truly valuable about them, right? We're able to desire them because they're kind of valuable, inherently valuable people. And so then what we have through this kind of desiring of what is truly valuable is a purification of desire, a reorientation of desire away from the self, right? I wish you were better at remembering to do the dishes because that would make my life easier. And instead, a desire that's kind of purified of self-interest, a desire just for the person for their own sake. So, hopefully some of the language I've used already might make it seem why a sort of roughly Kantian notion of disinterest might be useful here, or why Murdoch might be drawn to such a thing. And she thinks that loving attention and aesthetic appreciation have quite a bit in common. So they both, as I've pitched the kind of Murdochian love, involve this discovery of reality, right? Through the imagination. So kind of purifying desire in such a way that allows us to properly explore the reality of something else. In the aesthetic case, it's the reality of an artwork, right? It's the reality of the kind of fictional world of a novel that you're reading, or the depicted world of a painting that you're looking at. And in the loving case, it's the reality of the person that you love, right? The reality of your beloved. So what's important for Murdoch in both cases is that all of those realities are valuable for their own sake. The reality of the novel, the reality of the painting, the reality of the beloved are all valuable regardless of what I may or may not do with them, right? Regardless of the role they fit or play in my particular plans and projects. They're kind of valuable for their own sake. And Murdoch, in her kind of Kantian inheritance, is quite drawn to this idea of independence and the for itself of these realities, right? She thinks that that's the right mode of evaluation to take up in the loving case, and the right mode of evaluation to take up in the aesthetic case. So she draws on this idea that Kant articulates kind of early on in the third critique, that what we should really do when we're trying to kind of make a judgment of beauty is we should make it apart from any self-interest. So we should make it apart from my particular needs and desires. We should make it apart from how the object might fit into those needs and desires, right? We should make it apart from selfish gratification or selfish satisfaction. The delight we get in representations of beautiful objects for Kant is a pure disinterested delight. And that's the kind of delight that Murdoch thinks goes on in genuine loving attention. That's the kind of delight we should aim for in our loving relationships. But one kind of salient difference here is that in the Kantian picture, desire isn't really in play. And in Murdoch's picture, desire is in play. We desire in a disinterested way, which for the Kantian doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but for Murdoch does, because she thinks there are better and worse ways of desiring. Loving attention and aesthetic appreciation are both practices where we try to improve our desires, where we try to desire something for its own sake, desire something that is inherently valuable, desire something for the right reasons, right? In some cases. So Murdoch thinks a model of aesthetic appreciation that is disinterested is the right kind of model for thinking about loving attention. Now, I take it that you might not, right? I take it that might sound at least a little bit strange, the idea that we should desire someone apart from our own self-interest, the idea that we should desire someone in a way that doesn't make reference back to ourselves. Because, of course, in our relationships, we do that all the time. We constantly think about kind of ourself when we're making sense of our love for others, right? And we often kind of value or love other people because of how they make us feel. We use our kind of own subjective inclinations to make sense of you know, who we're drawn to, who we want to be with, why we might love someone. So I think there are a host of objections that you might have roughly to this kind of view that I think are all roughly connected to this idea of the disinterestedness of loving attention and how applicable it might be from the aesthetic case into the loving case. So the first objection that I want to start with is the idea that this model might not be compatible with genuine attachment. And there's a really good paper that I'd highly recommend by Daniela Dover called Love's Curiosity, where she kind of starts by, as I've just done, sort of giving a sort of gloss on the Murdochian account of love. And then she kind of shifts gears and she says, look, this just can't be right. You know, that this can't be the account we want for how we love people. this kind of calm, meditative, Murdochian love, as she puts it, just cannot be the right way for thinking about loving interactions, which are interactions, right? They're something we do with other people, not at other people. We look at a painting, we listen to a piece of music, we read a book, but we love with someone else, right? That's surely crucial. She thinks that the picture that Murdoch is giving us of love is just incompatible in a fundamental sense with genuine attachment, with genuinely wanting the other person, right? A kind of attached desire. Because of course, if desire is supposed to be disinterested in love, how can it be attached? Kant, in places, talks about, disinterest in terms of a disinterest in the continued existence of the kind of object, right? The beautiful object or the thing that is being represented. And I mean, again, if I said to my partner, I love you, in a way that is kind of detached from your continued existence, right? I love you, even if you died tomorrow, I'd love you. They'd be like, well, can you love me because I'm nice or funny or interesting? Like, does it have to be apart from my continued existence? And we're, of course, not disinterested about the continued existence of our loved ones. We're incredibly invested in the continued existence of our loved ones. That's why grief is so shit. So there's clearly something a little strange about this account, and I think you could, pause it in terms of attachment. The possibility for being attached to not just the continued existence of our loved ones, but just attached to them, right? And in fact, Julia Messeros, who has written a really interesting book on Murdochian love, she says that she thinks that this account is basically incompatible with reciprocation. It asks us to be so detached from our loved ones that it makes it possible. In fact, it really calls on us to love regardless of whether other people love us back. So she said, Murdoch's true lover will be reluctant to allow another human being to, in one way or another, return his love. Real personal union or intimacy, in particular, is thereby rendered impossible. Now, I should add, this is someone who's sympathetic to Murdoch's account, right? Even someone sympathetic to Murdochian love thinks that basically real union on this account is impossible. Because as soon as someone returns your affections, right, as soon as you establish a kind of mutual attachment with someone, presumably you introduce self-interest, right? You introduce kind of the possibility for gratification. And then you've lost this kind of disinterested thing that we're supposed to be aiming for. This unselfing, this perception without reverie, this perception that doesn't make reference back to the self. I take it that the motion behind this objection is that if love is supposed to be disinterested, genuine attachment to the people we love is impossible. It becomes this kind of detached meditation on them instead of a real union. Now, what's really interesting to me is that in Metaphysics as a Guide to Morals, Murdoch explicitly says not only that love is sort of compatible with union, with attachment, but also that this represents a point of difference between loving attention and aesthetic appreciation. She notes that essentially, unlike our love for art objects, our love for other people is, as she puts it, far less detached. So in fact, what's different about kind of loving attention and aesthetic appreciation is that in the loving case, we are more attached. We do experience this attachment. She writes that in spite all the warnings mentioned above, love of lovers, of family, of friends is an ultimate consolation, an ultimate saviour. The world is illumined by secure mutual love when we can stand together and look at something else. So she does think that the view she's developing is compatible with some kind of reciprocation or union, attachment, whatever you want to call it. And I take it that that's because she thinks it's possible to have an unselfish attachment. It's possible to have an attachment that is still disinterested, essentially. Disinterested in this unusual sense, right? Because presumably it can't be the strict Kantian sense. It can't be the strict Kantian sense of, being kind of experiencing a pleasure apart from any kind of the continued existence of the object, right? Because of course we are attached in this case. We do care if our loved ones continue to exist. I think here that what's going on is that Murdoch thinks we need, for genuine love, desire that is unpossessive. So it's not that we don't care whether our loved ones continue to exist. It's that we need a desire that isn't sort of inherently selfish, that doesn't try to use the loved one for some kind of plan or project that I've got, right? An unselfish desire. She thinks that, that kind of desire can still involve the self in some sense, because it's obviously coming from a place, it's coming from a person. And she acknowledges that really the self is this kind of mechanism of attachments, as she calls it. So this is a place where Simone Weil and Iris Murdoch slightly depart from one another, because I think, in my sense, Weil has like a much stronger sense of unselfing, where the self really is removed from the picture in the sense of what she calls decreation. Murdoch is saying it's not so much that the self is removed from love, but rather that the ego is removed from love, understood as selfishness, understood as our kind of selfish, self-interested desires. That's what we need to get rid of in love. And that's why disinterest is useful to her, because it describes this mode of engagement that isn't kind of selfish, a way of desiring that isn't possessive. That's, I think, what she wants from this notion of disinterest. So it's, to my mind, it's disinterested without being detached. We don't need to annihilate the self in our loving relationships. We don't need to only ever kind of stand back and appreciate or admire the way we would in artwork. We don't even need to, I think, love in such a way that we don't care about our returned affections, right? We don't even need to kind of worry about other people loving us back in a way that might kind of force gratification. There is a way of being for Murdoch in a kind of union that is nonetheless sort of disinterested in the sense of unselfish, right? That, I think, is what she's after. And that, I think, is much less bizarre than some people might make it sound. For one thing, I think it's quite similar to what Simone de Beauvoir says about love, and the ways in which love should be a kind of experience of freedom that allows the other to go free, right? I think that's basically what Murdoch wants to get at. So I don't think we need to throw detachment. I don't think we need to throw attachment out, right? We can love in a way that is disinterested in this aesthetic sense without necessarily being detached. So what about the kind of second objection that I mentioned, this sort of better lovers objection? Murdoch says at various points in her work that she sees this kind of connection between loving attention and aesthetic appreciation, and that one can be a kind of analogon for the other. But she also suggests they're sort of connected in a way that allows us to sort of see similarities between the practices. So she says, for example, that the art marks a path through the aesthetic and into the moral. So it's not just that these things are similar, it's that they're kind of feeding into each other. And a popular interpretation of this that you come across quite a lot in Murdoch scholarship is a sort of virtue theory about art. So the thought that artworks are these kinds of moral training grounds that allow us to kind of get better at our various moral responses, because they allow us to refine our moral responses by sort of deploying them, seeing how they work, and then understanding what's gone wrong and improving, right? So it's this kind of virtuous moral education. This is the kind of view that people associate with Nussbaum, but it's also kind of associated with Anil Gomes's reading of Murdoch. The thought here, I think, on this reading of Murdoch is that because we can practice because we can practice aesthetic appreciation in the artistic case, we can then kind of get better at unselfing more broadly. So if the aesthetic case calls for us to do this unselfing work, this perception without reverie, this reorientation of desire, surely that kind of reorientation of desire is going to have benefits in other areas where we need to unself, like the moral case or the loving case, right? Which I'm treating differently here, but that might not be super helpful because she thinks they're quite similar. But nonetheless, let's suggest for the moment that there's a kind of mode of engagement with the other that's loving, and then another that's kind of a straightforward moral engagement with another person, just to keep the kind of objection clear. So the thought in the moral case is that if you engage with art in the right way, if you practice this mode of engagement that art calls for, you'll then be able to develop that same mode of engagement as it's required in the moral sphere. Now, an obvious objection, and one that has been kind of done to death in the aesthetics literature, is that people who are steeped in great art, people who are good at practicing this aesthetic appreciation, are often assholes, right? Like the great artists, your Picassos, your Mozarts, like all these amazing, amazing artists. But even your art critics, right? Your film critics, your your uncle who has like an incredible kind of collection of 70s vinyl, right? But then, gets to Christmas dinner table and says racist things, and you're like, oh. So, it's kind of a familiar anecdotal fact that people who are good at this art stuff don't tend to be better at the human stuff. But it's also a kind of well-established empirical fact that it's at least cagey whether kind of doing this aesthetic practice is going to get us better moral results. There's Iris Vidmar-Jovanovic has written about this, but there's tons of work on this. It's a huge question because psychologists are obsessed with the idea that we might be able to read our way into being good people. It's unfortunately the one time I've had to cite Jordan Peterson because he was involved with a really significant study on this, where I think it's called Bookworms something, and it's a major, major study from the early noughties about whether reading made us better at empathy. And so if you engage in this debate in the aesthetics literature, you end up having to cite it. It's very frustrating. So it's at least a question mark in the moral case whether being better at art is going to make us better people. Why could we not say the same thing for the love case, right? Why think that being better at aesthetic appreciation is going to make you a better lover, a better partner, a better person to be in a relationship with? Because presumably that same correlation that's missing in the moral case, we also think of as missing in the love case. At least it's not it's not common knowledge, it's not a sort of well-established correlation, right? So I take it then that the objection might just be that given the absence of this correlation between the aesthetic case and the loving case, this kind of connection between loving attention and aesthetic appreciation is going to look a little sort of flimsy, right? Or at least under-supported. I think that this objection kind of misunderstands what Murdoch wants to put across by making this analogy. So she's very clear that love is very, very difficult. That most of us, most of the time, are really bad at it. It's something that requires great effort. She refers to it elsewhere as an extremely difficult realization that something other than oneself exists, right? It's not easy. And she thinks that most of the time, what we're doing in our loving relationships, when we love people, is just flawed, quite simply. And that we are often loving in this kind of selfish mode. What she sees herself as doing is presenting an ideal. an ideal of love that we should aim for, that we should strive for. But of course, what's interesting about her ideal is that it's largely an internal work. So it's a kind of personal, internal project. We could be sat in a room together, right? And I could be doing this work of unselfing. I could be trying really hard to understand things from my partner's point of view. Why didn't he do the dishes, right? And you can have no idea. You can think, oh, Colette's just daydreaming again, right? Because there's no kind of external outward sign necessarily. Part of Murdoch's moral project is to really say that that's the right way to think about moral work. Because it's not about kind of refining one's actions or the kind of external signs of one's inner life. It's just doing that personal moral work yourself. So I think we shouldn't be surprised that, we don't tend to see this correlation. Not just because it's a largely internal practice, a largely kind of personal internal practice, but also because we're just really bad at it. Very few of us are doing this genuine unselfing love, right? Most of the time our love is only ever imperfectly realized. The key that Murdoch wants us to focus on is that, there are ways that we can be better at it, and that's what we should strive to do, that's what we should aim to do. So, hopefully that kind of says something to the supporter of the better lovers objection, right? I want to end by thinking about this last objection I mentioned, this kind of impersonal objection, which is whether the view could be compatible with a genuinely personal love. If our response in love is supposed to be to what is truly valuable in the other, presumably our response in love is to something that is of universal value, right? If I'm responding to, regardless of my particular inclinations or my subjective inclinations, my subjective likings, my desires, my preferences, all that set aside, and I'm just responding to what is truly valuable in you, that's presumably, as it's supposed to be in the aesthetic case for Kant, universally accessible, right? The reason why Kant likes this idea of disinterest is because it creates space for the idea that there could be a beauty that was in principle open to everyone, that we could all experience if we were in the right state of mind, right? Presumably what Murdoch is saying is that if we're all in the right state of mind, if we're all doing this unselfing activity, and we're all really good at it in this hypothetical world where we're all perfect lovers, couldn't we all love everyone, right? And maybe that's what she's going for. Maybe she's going for a kind of hippy-dippy, right-on man, we should love everyone kind of vibe. But that might seem implausible as an account of interpersonal relationships, right? Where we think that actually, largely we form specific attachments with specific people because we like specific things about them. Our love, generally speaking, is personal. Not just in the sense that it's a response to kind of personal features about someone else, personal particularities, but also in the sense that it says something about me. It says something about me that I can love my brother, right? And importantly, I don't expect any of you to love him, right? He's kind of a weird guy. I wouldn't be surprised if you guys found him kind of strange. It's lucky my parents had 2 kids and one of them turned out so great, right? So the point is, it seems at least strange to kind of create space for the idea that there could be kind of a universal lovability in every person, right? And there is a kind of analogous worry that people have in the aesthetic case. Jessica Williams has a manuscript on this that's about the kind of impersonal objection but applied to Kantian aesthetics, where the thought is something like, we shouldn't sort of aim or strive for this judgment that permits of universal accessibility, because that's just not what our relationships with artworks are like. We like really specific kinds of artwork. I really like Shrek. Do I think you should all really like Shrek? Of course not. Do I think that if we were all in this kind of disinterested, aesthetically appreciative mode, we would all say, Shrek's a sick film? No. And I shouldn't, that's kind of just what art is like. It is personal. reflects something about me, but it's also, reflecting something about the artwork. There's something specific about it that I connect to and that kind of, registers for me. Presumably our love should be like that, right? And I think here, actually, the analogy works in Murdoch's favour, because she thinks that we don't access this kind of universal value merely through unselfing. We access it through the particular. So I don't access the kind of what is truly valuable in my partner just by unselfing. I need detail. The detail is the way into what is truly valuable, right? So she says, a contemplative observation of contingent, trivial, in quotation marks, detail, insects, leaves, shapes of screwed up paper, looks and shadows of anything, expressions of faces, is a prevalent and usually, at least in some minimal sense, unselfing activity of consciousness. And she's talking about this in the context of a painting, of a Cézanne, and the ways in which the little details of the Cézanne offer us a kind of way into the value of the painting, right? You don't just look at the Cézanne and get it. You need to appreciate these little details. But what's significant for her is that these details are not just what allow us to access the value of the work, they're also what trigger this unselfing. So in these details, in this kind of contemplation of the particular, right, the specificities of an artwork or a person, we're able to lose ourselves, right? We're able to silence all that kind of, self-interest that's going on in the back of our brains all the time. Should I like this painting? Have I been standing here too long? Are people going to think I'm weird for standing here so long? I really ought to like Cézanne, right? My mum likes Cézanne. I should probably like Cézanne. Liking Cézanne seems like a really cultured thing to do. Like, all that self-interest just gets silenced when you find something in it you really like, right? A patch of green leaf, a little insect, some kind of swathe of colour, right? And that's what's going on in the love case as well for Murdoch. We get lost in the details of the people we love. We appreciate, what we sometimes call the little things. The way someone laughs, the way someone is kind of fastidious about something. People that get to the airport too early, right, and get really nervous about travelling. All those sorts of little details about a person are what kind of reveal their value to us. But they're also the way into the project of understanding them. Because the point of love for Murdoch is that through these details, we can understand the reality of the other person, what their life is like. Not on our terms, but on their terms. And love should really be this kind of continued enriching, this continued exploration of this detail. The longer we love someone, the more detail we find, the more we find to love, right? And it's a kind of imaginative activity because as we build up these details, we build up a picture of a person's life that we can hold in our heads, right? And it's not like the fantasy, imagining who they should be, who we want them to be. It's them as they really are. So this, I think, represents a similarity, a strength of the analogy, a place where love and art do seem to be good models for each other. Loving attention should be triggered by detail, should be kind of explored through detail, enriched through detail, as should aesthetic appreciation. It's about really kind of discovering a reality other than our own through this sort of mode of a non-possessive desire, right? An appreciative desire. And that's the sense in which we should kind of love our loved ones or treat them like artworks. We should find their details. We should linger there, right? As we would in a gallery, as we would kind of if we reread a passage over and over again of a favourite book. Because that's how we're really going to understand them. That's what we need to do if we really want to understand them. And that's what we need to do if we want to aim or strive or realise this quite lofty ideal of genuine loving attention, right? Thank you very much.